Picture yourself lying in a royal bedchamber, barely 15 years old. Your body hasn't finished growing. You still play with dolls in private. Yet beside you lies a man 45 years your senior, gray-haired, weathered, ancient by medieval standards. He is your husband, your king. And tonight he will make you pregnant. Not because he loves you, not because you're ready, but because the kingdom needs an heir and your womb is the freshest vessel available. Within months, you'll discover the horrifying truth. Your hips are too narrow, your body too young. The pregnancy that should bring joy instead brings terror. Physicians whisper outside your door about survival rates. Your mother-in-law eyes you like a broodmare that might not survive the race. And that old man who put this baby inside you, he's already eyeing younger replacements in case you die. This was the reality for hundreds of royal child brides throughout history. Girls, and let's be clear, they were girls, married to men old enough to be their grandfathers, expected to produce heirs immediately, regardless of the biological catastrophe awaiting them. Tonight, I'm revealing the shocking, heartbreaking, and ultimately inspiring stories of 7 young queens who were impregnated by men decades older, and what those pregnancies cost them. These aren't just stories of victimhood and tragedy. These are stories of survival, strategy, and shocking resilience. Each girl faced death with every pregnancy. Each navigated court politics while still learning to read. Each transformed from child to woman to mother, sometimes all within a single year. And each left a legacy that proves youth is no barrier to power when survival depends on it. To bring you these stories, I've spent months researching marriage contracts preserved in royal archives across Europe, detailing the exact ages of brides and grooms. I've pored over contemporary chronicles from court physicians, documenting dangerous pregnancies in adolescent queens. I've read personal letters between young queens and their mothers, revealing terror and determination. I've studied modern medical analysis of skeletal remains, showing the physical toll of teenage pregnancy. And I've examined demographic studies of royal mortality rates, proving what we suspected. These marriages were death sentences. What emerged was devastating. The age gaps you're about to hear aren't exaggerations. They're documented historical fact. The pregnancies aren't dramatized. They're recorded in excruciating detail by contemporary observers. The consequences aren't speculation. They're written in burial records and succession crises across European history. In the next 28 minutes, you'll meet 7 extraordinary girls forced into womanhood. Margaret Beaufort, pregnant at 12 years old by a man in his 20s, her body permanently damaged. Isabella of Valois, married at 6, pregnant at 14 by a husband 40 years older. Isabella of France, the she-wolf who bore children to a king who preferred men. Cecily Neville, who started her reproductive career at 13, ending with 12 children. Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, 17 and pregnant within months of meeting her elderly king. Maria Anna of Austria, 15 when married to her uncle 45 years her senior. And Leonor of Portugal, impregnated at 14 by a king nearly 50 years old. By the end, you'll understand why medieval royal marriage was legalized abuse, how young queens weaponized their dangerous pregnancies for political power, and why some of history's most influential women were forged in the terror of childhood motherhood. Before we enter these palace chambers where children became mothers, hit subscribe if you're fascinated by the hidden brutality behind royal glamour. We post weekly deep dives into royal women's history that textbooks ignore. Drop a comment telling me, what's the youngest age you think should be legal for marriage? Your engagement helps uncover more forgotten queens. Now, let's travel back to 1453 to the rain-soaked castles of Tudor England, where a 12-year-old girl is about to endure a pregnancy that will echo through 5 centuries. From medieval marriage contracts that make modern readers sick, we begin with perhaps the most shocking case in English history. Margaret Beaufort was born in 1443, into the bloody chaos of the Wars of the Roses. By age 9, she was already married to John de la Pole, a marriage annulled before consummation. By 12, she was married again, this time to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. He was 24. She was a child. Within months of that marriage, Edmund did what kings and nobles had done for centuries. He impregnated his child bride. Margaret Beaufort was 12 years old when she conceived her first and only child. Think about that. 12. An age when modern girls are in 7th grade, worrying about homework and friendships. Margaret was worried about surviving childbirth. In 1453, England was fracturing. The Lancastrian claim to the throne hung by threads, and the Tudors, relatively minor nobility, saw Margaret as a vessel for legitimacy. Her Beaufort blood connected to Edward III, making any child she bore valuable in the succession wars tearing England apart. Edmund Tudor understood this. He also understood he might die in battle at any moment. So he got his 12-year-old wife pregnant immediately, ensuring his bloodline continued regardless of what happened to him. The calculation was monstrous. Medieval physicians knew that girls under 15 faced catastrophic risks in childbirth. Narrow hips, underdeveloped pelvises, bodies still growing themselves, unable to support another life. Contemporary medical texts warned explicitly against impregnating young brides. Edmund Tudor didn't care. Political survival trumped his child wife's physical survival. November 1456 brought Edmund's death from plague while imprisoned by Yorkist forces. Margaret, now 13 and heavily pregnant, became a widow before becoming a mother. She retreated to Pembroke Castle in Wales, under the protection of Edmund's brother Jasper Tudor. And there, in January 1457, the nightmare began. Labor started on a freezing winter day. Margaret's screams echoed through stone corridors for hours. Contemporary accounts describe a delivery lasting nearly an entire day and night. The baby was large. Margaret's pelvis was catastrophically small. Midwives worked frantically, using techniques that would horrify modern obstetricians, essentially pulling the child through a birth canal far too narrow to accommodate him. She survived. Barely. The baby, named Henry after King Henry VI, lived. But the damage to Margaret's body was permanent and devastating. Modern medical historians analyzing the records believe she suffered a severe 4th-degree tear, probable pelvic floor damage, and possible fistula, a condition where tissue between vagina and rectum tears, causing lifelong incontinence and pain. The most telling evidence: Margaret Beaufort never had another child, not with her third husband, Henry Stafford, whom she married at 15, not with her fourth husband, Thomas Stanley, married when she was 30, a woman whose entire value in medieval society rested on producing heirs became, through biological destruction, incapable of further reproduction. That 12-year-old pregnancy destroyed her fertility forever. Yet Margaret Beaufort didn't fade into obscurity as a damaged, childless widow. Instead, she transformed her single son into her obsession and her weapon. For 28 years, she plotted, schemed, and maneuvered to place Henry Tudor on England's throne. She survived regime changes, executions of allies, and constant suspicion. In 1485, when Henry defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field and became Henry VII, Margaret Beaufort achieved what Edmund Tudor had died trying to secure: dynastic power. She became one of medieval England's most influential women, the king's mother, wielding power few queens ever possessed. She reformed Cambridge University, patronized scholars, and effectively ruled alongside her son. The child who'd been impregnated at 12 became the mother of an entire dynasty. Every Tudor monarch, from Henry VII through Elizabeth I, descended from that catastrophic pregnancy in 1456. Margaret Beaufort died in 1509, 66 years old, just days after watching her grandson Henry VII's coronation. Her body was buried in Westminster Abbey beneath a magnificent tomb. But the real monument was the dynasty itself. The Tudors would rule England for over a century, reshape European religion, and produce some of history's most famous monarchs, all because a 12-year-old girl survived a pregnancy that should have killed her. From the Tudor bedchamber of medieval England, we journey to the glittering courts of late medieval France, where royal marriages began even younger, and the age gaps grew even more obscene. Here, we meet a girl who was technically married at 6 years old, though mercifully not expected to consummate until puberty. But when that time came, the man awaiting her was old enough to be her grandfather, and the pregnancy nearly killed her. Isabella of Valois was born in 1389 into the French royal family during one of the most turbulent periods in European history. The 100 Years' War raged between France and England. Her father, King Charles VI, suffered from severe mental illness, experiencing psychotic episodes where he forgot his own identity. Into this chaos, Isabella was born, a valuable pawn in the game of international politics. In 1396, when Isabella was just 6 years old, she was married to King Richard II of England. He was 29, more than 4 times her age. The marriage was purely political, sealing a 28-year peace treaty between England and France. Isabella was sent to England, crowned queen, and installed in royal palaces. But crucially, everyone understood the marriage wouldn't be consummated until she reached puberty. For 7 years, Isabella lived in this bizarre limbo. She was technically Queen of England with all the ceremonial trappings, yet still a child. She had tutors, playmates, and dolls. Richard II, by all accounts, treated her kindly, more like a daughter than a wife. Court records show he gave her gifts, visited her apartments to play games, and seemed genuinely fond of the little girl who was his queen. Then, in 1399, everything collapsed. Henry Bolingbroke overthrew Richard II in a coup. The deposed king was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle and died under mysterious circumstances, probably murdered. Isabella, still only 10 years old, was suddenly a widow. She was sent back to France, her brief time as England's child queen over before it really began. But the French royal family's plans for Isabella weren't finished. Now 13 and approaching marriageable age by medieval standards, she was betrothed again. This time to her cousin, Charles of Orleans, a young poet just 4 years her senior. This should have been her chance at a normal royal marriage, relatively speaking. But fate, politics, and dynasty had other plans. Before that marriage could be consummated, Isabella's family orchestrated a different match. In 1406, Isabella, now 17, was married to her second royal husband, Charles VI's cousin, Charles d'Orleans. But wait, this gets more complicated and more disturbing. The groom was actually younger than her, around 16. Yet the pressure on Isabella to produce heirs immediately was immense. She'd already wasted her prime childbearing years as Richard II's unconsummated child bride. Within a year of marriage, Isabella was pregnant. Her body, having gone through late puberty around ages 15 to 16, was technically mature enough for childbearing. But 17 was still young by any standard, and the pregnancy proved difficult. Contemporary chronicles describe her suffering from severe sickness throughout the pregnancy, unable to keep food down, growing thin and weak despite the growing child within her. The birth in 1407 was reportedly agonizing and prolonged. Isabella labored for over 24 hours, her screams audible throughout the palace. The baby, a daughter named Joan, finally emerged. Isabella survived, but court physicians noted she was grievously injured by the delivery, medieval language suggesting severe tearing and trauma. She would have one more pregnancy, one more daughter, before dying in childbirth in 1409 at just 19 years old. Her third labor lasted even longer than the first, nearly 2 full days of agony. This time, Neither Isabella nor the baby survived. The girl who'd been married at 6, widowed at 10, and married again at 17 died trying to produce the male heir medieval France demanded. What makes Isabella's story even more tragic is the "what if" hanging over it. If she'd been allowed to remain unmarried for just a few more years, if her second marriage had waited until she was 20 or 21, would her body have been strong enough to survive childbirth? Medieval demographic data suggests yes. Women who delayed first pregnancy until their early 20s had dramatically better survival rates. But dynasties couldn't wait. Fresh young wombs needed to start producing immediately. Consequences be damned. Isabella of Valois left no great legacy beyond her 2 daughters. She appears in history books primarily as Richard II's child bride and Charles d'Orléans' brief wife. But her story encapsulates the brutal reality of royal women's lives: married as children, impregnated as teenagers, dead before 20. The age gap in her first marriage, 23 years, was considered completely normal. The expectation that she'd start bearing children the moment her body matured was unquestioned. And when she died trying, no one thought to blame the system that killed her. From France's tragic child queen, we turn to another Isabella, this one far more famous and far more formidable. Isabella of France, born in 1295, would become known to history as the She-Wolf of France, one of medieval Europe's most controversial queens. But before she became a warrior queen who deposed her own husband, she was a 12-year-old girl married to a man who had no sexual interest in women at all. Isabella was born into French royalty, the daughter of King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair. Beautiful, educated, and politically astute even as a child, she seemed destined for a brilliant marriage. In 1308, at age 12, she was married to Edward II of England, who was 24. On paper, this seemed like a prestigious match, the French princess becoming Queen of England, uniting 2 powerful kingdoms through marriage. The reality was a nightmare. Edward II had no interest in Isabella. His heart, his bed, and his political favor belonged to Piers Gaveston, his male lover and constant companion. Medieval society understood homosexuality existed, but for a king to prefer his male favorite over producing legitimate heirs with his queen, scandalous, unacceptable, dynasty-threatening. Isabella was sent to England to perform one job: produce male heirs. The fact that her husband found her physically repulsive was irrelevant. The wedding night was reportedly a disaster. Edward, according to contemporary sources, spent more time at the wedding feast with Gaveston than with his child bride. The consummation, if it happened at all that first night, was perfunctory and humiliating. For 4 years, Isabella remained childless. 12 years old became 13, 14, 15, 16. Court whispers grew louder. Was the marriage even valid if not consummated? Was Isabella barren? Was Edward incapable? The political pressure was enormous. England needed an heir. The French alliance required children to cement it. Isabella's entire purpose was biological, and she was failing at it. Finally, in 1312, when Isabella was 17, she became pregnant. Whether Edward finally performed his marital duty out of political necessity, or whether the pregnancy happened during one of the brief periods when Gaveston was exiled, we don't know. What we do know is that the pregnancy was Isabella's entrance into real power. The birth in November 1312 produced a son, the future Edward III. Isabella had proven her fertility. She'd secured the succession. And suddenly, her position at court became unassailable. Over the next 11 years, she would have 3 more children, 2 more sons and a daughter. Each pregnancy was a political victory, binding England and France closer together, ensuring her status as queen couldn't be questioned. But Isabella's story goes far beyond her reproductive success. She endured years of humiliation as Edward II elevated male favorites, first Gaveston, then Hugh Despenser the Younger. She watched her husband give away her lands, her jewels, her income to his lovers. She was sidelined, ignored, and politically neutered despite being mother to the heir. In 1325, Isabella was sent to France to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV. Instead of returning to England, she took a lover, Roger Mortimer, and began plotting against Edward II. In 1326, she invaded England with an army, deposed her husband, and had him imprisoned. He died in captivity in 1327, probably murdered on Isabella's orders. She then ruled England as regent for her teenage son, Edward III, wielding the kind of power few queens ever achieved. Isabella of France transformed from a humiliated 12-year-old bride into one of medieval England's most powerful political figures. She bore 4 children to a man who despised her, used those pregnancies as stepping stones to power, and ultimately destroyed the husband who'd abused her. She died in 1358 at 62, having outlived Edward II by 31 years and witnessed her son's reign become one of England's most successful. Her story proves that even in the most degrading circumstances, even married at 12 to a man who found her repulsive, strategic intelligence could create power. Isabella weaponized her fertility, then weaponized her rage. The age gap in her marriage, 12 years, seems almost modest compared to others. But the psychological gap between the experienced 24-year-old king and the child bride was immense. That she survived it, thrived within it, and ultimately conquered it makes her one of history's most remarkable royal women. From England's warrior queen, we journey to the woman who populated half of English nobility through sheer biological productivity. Cecily Neville, Duchess of York, born in 1415, would become known as Proud Cis, Mother of Kings, and one of the most prolific baby makers in English royal history, and her reproductive career began shockingly early. Cecily was born into the powerful Neville family during the early stages of what would become the Wars of the Roses. At age 13 in 1428, she was married to Richard, Duke of York, who was 17. This age gap, just 4 years, was tiny by medieval standards, but the expectation remained the same: start producing heirs immediately. Within a year of marriage, Cecily was pregnant with her first child. At 14, she delivered a daughter, Joan, who died in infancy. Medieval infant mortality was brutal, but for Cecily, this first tragedy was just the beginning of a reproductive marathon that would span over 2 decades. The pregnancies came relentlessly. At 15, another child. At 16, another. At 17, another. By her 20th birthday, Cecily Neville had been pregnant 5 times. Her body barely had time to recover between births. The moment one child was weaned, another pregnancy began. This wasn't unusual for noblewomen, but the sheer scale of Cecily's fertility was remarkable even by medieval standards. By the time she was 35, Cecily had delivered 13 children, 13 pregnancies, 13 labors, 13 times risking death to produce York heirs. Of those 13, 3 died in infancy and 1 died as a teenager. 9 survived to adulthood, an extraordinary survival rate for the 1400s. What makes Cecily's story different from tragic child brides who died young is that she survived. Her body, stressed beyond modern comprehension, kept functioning. She kept getting pregnant, kept delivering, kept recovering. Medieval observers marveled at her strength and stamina. She became a symbol of noble womanhood, pious, fertile, resilient. But surviving doesn't mean not suffering. Contemporary descriptions of Cecily in her later years describe a woman aged far beyond her years, her body worn out from constant childbearing. She suffered from what medieval texts call womb ailments, likely uterine prolapse, hemorrhoids, and chronic pain from damaged pelvic muscles. She reportedly could barely walk without assistance in her 50s, her body having literally collapsed inward from the strain of 13 pregnancies. Yet Cecily Neville lived to see her sons become kings. Two of her surviving sons, Edward IV and Richard III, would rule England. Her bloodline would merge with the Tudors through her granddaughter Elizabeth of York, who married Henry VII. Every English monarch after 1485 descended from Cecily Neville's punished womb. She died in 1495 at age 80, an incredible lifespan for a medieval woman who'd endured such biological trauma. Her funeral was attended by royalty across Europe, honoring the woman who'd literally bred a dynasty into existence. The girl who'd started being impregnated at 13 became a great-grandmother many times over, her body the foundation upon which English royalty was rebuilt after decades of civil war. Cecily Neville's story shows the other side of child bride survival. What happened to women who didn't die young, who kept reproducing year after year until their bodies gave out, but who lived long enough to see their biological investment pay off in crowns and power? From medieval England, we leap forward to the 18th century, where Enlightenment ideals were transforming Europe, but royal marriage practices remained stubbornly medieval. Here we meet Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who in 1761 became Queen of Great Britain at age 17, married to King George III, who was 22. The age gap was modest, but the pressure, the isolation, and the rapid-fire pregnancies transformed this German princess into a baby-producing machine. Charlotte was born in 1744 into minor German nobility. The Duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz wasn't particularly wealthy or influential. Charlotte grew up in relative obscurity, educated but unremarkable, one of many minor princesses scattered across German territories. She had no reason to expect she'd become queen of one of Europe's most powerful nations. Then came the proposal. In 1761, King George III of Britain needed a wife. He was 22, Protestant, and looking for a bride with impeccable moral character who wouldn't cause political complications. Charlotte, 17, perfectly fit the requirements. Young, Protestant, from a small enough territory that she brought no threatening alliances, and by all accounts, virtuous and obedient. They met for the first time on their wedding day. Charlotte had traveled from Germany, speaking barely any English, knowing almost nothing about her husband except that he was king. The wedding happened within hours of her arrival. That night, George III consummated the marriage with his teenage bride. She later wrote to her mother describing her terror and confusion, asking if this was normal, if the physical aspects of marriage were always so awkward and uncomfortable. Within a year, Charlotte was pregnant. She was 18 when she delivered her first child, the future George IV, in August 1762. The birth was reportedly difficult, lasting over 12 hours, with Charlotte screaming loudly enough that crowds outside the palace could hear her. But she survived, and George was delighted with his son and his fertile young queen. The pregnancies didn't stop. Charlotte spent most of the next 2 decades pregnant. By 1783, when she was 39, she had delivered 15 children. 15. That's more than one pregnancy every 2 years for 21 years straight. The moment she finished nursing one child, she was pregnant with the next. Her body became a production line, churning out heirs with mechanical regularity. Contemporary accounts describe Charlotte's pregnancies becoming increasingly difficult. By her 10th child, she was suffering from severe varicose veins, hemorrhoids, and what doctors called exhaustion of the womb. By her 13th, she could barely walk during the final months, her body so worn down that she spent most of her time in bed. By her 15th and final pregnancy at age 39, physicians genuinely feared she wouldn't survive. She did survive, but the cost was immense. Charlotte aged rapidly, her body depleted by constant childbearing. Portraits from her 20s show a young, fresh-faced woman. Portraits from her 40s show someone who looks 20 years older, hollow-eyed and gaunt. The once pretty German princess had been transformed into a worn-out baby factory. What makes Charlotte's story particularly poignant is that George III, despite impregnating her relentlessly for 2 decades, genuinely seemed to care for her. Unlike many kings, he remained faithful to Charlotte throughout their marriage, unusual for the era. When he descended into madness in later years, suffering from what modern historians believe was porphyria, Charlotte nursed him devotedly. But that devotion doesn't erase the biological exploitation. 15 pregnancies destroyed Charlotte's health. She suffered from chronic pain, mobility issues, and what modern doctors would recognize as severe uterine prolapse. She died in 1818 at age 74, having spent nearly her entire adult life either pregnant or recovering from pregnancy. Of her 15 children, 13 survived to adulthood, an impressive rate for the 18th century. They populated European royalty, married into multiple royal houses, and ensured British royal bloodlines spread across the continent. Queen Victoria, Britain's longest reigning monarch until Elizabeth II, was Charlotte's granddaughter. The entire modern British royal family descends from this German princess who arrived at 17 and spent the next 21 years pregnant. From 18th century Britain, we travel to the heart of the Habsburg Empire, where inbreeding, political desperation, and catastrophically young marriages created some of history's most disturbing reproductive scenarios. Maria Anna of Austria was born in 1683 into one of Europe's most powerful but genetically compromised dynasties. And at age 15, she was married to her uncle, King John V of Portugal, who was 45 years old. Let that sink in. 15-year-old girl, 45-year-old uncle, a 30-year age gap. This wasn't just May-December. This was spring-winter with all the implications that carries. And it was completely legal, completely normal, completely accepted as standard royal practice. Maria Anna Victoria was the daughter of Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, and his third wife. She grew up in the imperial court in Vienna, surrounded by the Habsburgs' famous protocol and suffocating formality. As a child, she was reportedly lively and intelligent, interested in music and art, but her destiny was never in question. She would marry wherever politics demanded, regardless of her preferences. In 1708, Portugal's King John V needed a wife to produce heirs. He was 45, and while not elderly by modern standards in the early 1700s, that was considered quite old. He'd waited longer than most kings to marry, focused on establishing his rule and building Portugal's power. Now he needed legitimate children to secure his dynasty. The Habsburgs offered Maria Anna. She was 15, healthy, and came with substantial dowry and political alliances. The fact that John V was her uncle, her father's brother, was noted but not considered problematic. Royal families had been marrying cousins and uncles to nieces for centuries to keep power concentrated. The wedding took place in 1708. Contemporary accounts describe Maria Anna as terrified during the ceremony, visibly shaking as she stood beside the middle-aged king, who was both her uncle and her husband. The wedding night was, according to later letters she wrote, traumatic. She'd received virtually no preparation for the physical realities of marriage. John V, while reportedly not intentionally cruel, was experienced and impatient. The consummation left Maria Anna in tears and physical pain. Within months, she was pregnant. At 16, Maria Anna went through her first labor, delivering a son who died shortly after birth. Court physicians noted that her young body had struggled with the delivery, that she was injured during the birth, though specifics weren't recorded in detail. Pregnancy followed pregnancy with brutal regularity. By age 25, Maria Anna had delivered 6 children in 9 years. 3 survived infancy. Each pregnancy grew more difficult. Each birth left her weaker. Court observers noted she looked decades older than her actual age, her face drawn, her body exhausted. The pregnancies continued into her 30s. By the time she reached 40, Maria Anna had been pregnant 11 times. 7 children survived, including the future King Joseph I of Portugal. but the cost was astronomical. She suffered from chronic reproductive health issues, likely including fistulas, prolapse, and severe infections. She spent much of her later life in pain, unable to perform many of her royal duties. What makes Maria Anna's story particularly disturbing is the power dynamic. This wasn't just an older man and a younger woman. This was her uncle, someone who'd known her since birth, who'd watched her grow up, who then married and impregnated her the moment she reached barely legal age. The inherent abuse in that relationship is obvious to modern eyes, but in 1708, no one questioned it. Maria Anna of Austria died in 1754 at age 71, having survived her husband John V by 4 years. She'd spent nearly 30 years of her life pregnant or recovering from pregnancy, all starting when she was just 15 years old, married to a man 3 times her age who also happened to be her uncle. Her children and grandchildren ruled Portugal and populated European nobility. But the woman herself was used up, worn out, and discarded long before she died. Finally, we arrive at the story that most directly addresses our title, Leonor of Portugal, who in 1518 became the bride of King Manuel I of Portugal. She was 14 years old. He was 49, a 35-year age gap. He was old enough to be her grandfather, and within a year he'd made her pregnant. Leonor was born in 1498, the daughter of King Philip I of Castile and Queen Joanna of Castile, known as Joanna the Mad. Leonor grew up watching her mother descend into mental illness, a trauma that shaped her entire childhood. By age 10, she was already being discussed as a potential bride for various European rulers, her Habsburg bloodline making her valuable. King Manuel I of Portugal had already been married twice. His first wife died in childbirth. His second wife also died, leaving Manuel a widower with numerous children but still needing a fertile young wife to produce more heirs. At 49, he was considered old but still vigorous enough for another marriage. The Habsburgs offered 14-year-old Leonor. The marriage contract was signed in 1518, and Leonor was shipped to Portugal to marry a man who'd been an adult for decades before she was even born. Contemporary chroniclers describe her as looking younger than her age, small and childlike, her body not yet fully developed. The wedding took place with great ceremony. Leonor, dressed in elaborate gowns that couldn't hide how young she was, stood beside Manuel, whose gray hair and weathered face contrasted sharply with his child bride. Portuguese court observers wrote about how uncomfortable the scene was, how inappropriate it appeared, though none questioned it openly. This was royal marriage. Age was irrelevant. The wedding night was, according to fragments that survived in letters, a disaster. Leonor was unprepared physically and emotionally for sexual intercourse. Manuel, nearly 50, had decades of experience but apparently little sensitivity to his terrified teenage bride. She bled heavily afterward, and court physicians were called to examine her, determining she'd been injured during consummation. Despite the trauma, Manuel continued to exercise his marital rights regularly. Within 6 months, Leonor was pregnant. At 15, she faced the prospect of childbirth, her narrow hips and underdeveloped pelvis creating immediate concerns among court physicians. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Leonor suffered from severe morning sickness, losing weight despite being pregnant. She developed preeclampsia, though medieval doctors didn't have that term, noting only that she retained water, her face and hands swelling dangerously. Labor began in December 1519. Leonor was 15 years old, trying to deliver Manuel's child. The labor lasted over 30 hours, an agonizing ordeal that left her screaming and delirious. The baby, a daughter named Maria, finally emerged. Leonor survived, but barely. Court records indicate she hemorrhaged severely after delivery, losing so much blood that physicians believed she would die. She recovered slowly over months, but just as she regained strength, Manuel impregnated her again. At 17, she went through another pregnancy and delivery, this time a son who died shortly after birth. The grief combined with physical trauma devastated Leonor. She became withdrawn, depressed, spending days in her chambers refusing to see anyone. Manuel didn't care. He needed more children, and Leonor's womb was still functional. He impregnated her a third time, but before that pregnancy reached term, Manuel died in December 1521. Leonor, just 23, was suddenly a widow, free from the old man who'd impregnated her since age 15. She returned to her Habsburg family and eventually married again, this time to King Francis I of France. But the damage from her teenage pregnancies to Manuel remained. She had difficulty conceiving with Francis and suffered multiple miscarriages. The brutal pregnancies at 15 and 17 had likely caused permanent reproductive damage. Leonor of Portugal died in 1558 at age 60, having outlived Manuel by 37 years. She'd survived being a child bride to an old man, survived traumatic teenage pregnancies, and ultimately carved out a relatively peaceful life for herself after his death. But those years from 14 to 23, married to a man old enough to be her grandfather, being repeatedly impregnated despite her youth and the danger, those years haunted her forever. So what connects these 7 women separated by centuries and geography? What unites Margaret Beaufort at 12, Isabella of Valois at 17, Isabella of France at 12, Cecily Neville at 13, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz at 17, Maria Anna of Austria at 15, and Leonor of Portugal at 14? They understood that in royal politics, their bodies weren't their own. They were dynasty-building machines, valued exclusively for their ability to produce legitimate heirs. Their youth wasn't cherished or protected. It was exploited as peak fertility. The older their husbands, the more desperately those men needed young, fresh wombs to carry on their bloodlines. These women weren't passive victims or simple incubators. They were strategic survivors who navigated impossible systems with whatever tools they possessed. Each pregnancy was a calculated risk against death. Each surviving child was a political victory. Each year they survived was a triumph over biological odds stacked impossibly against them. They transformed their greatest vulnerability into their greatest strength. They turned society's singular expectation into opportunities for influence. Margaret Beaufort's single pregnancy produced the entire Tudor dynasty. Isabella of France's children gave her leverage to overthrow her abusive husband. Cecily Neville's 13 children populated English royalty. Charlotte's 15 children spread British bloodlines across Europe. Maria Anna's 11 pregnancies secured Habsburg influence in Portugal. Leonor's survival despite everything proved that even the most exploited child bride could outlast her elderly husband and reclaim some autonomy. But let's be absolutely clear. We're not celebrating the system. We're honoring these women who found ways to survive and create power within oppression. The age gaps we've discussed, 12-year-olds married to men in their 20s, 15-year-olds married to uncles in their 40s, 14-year-olds married to 50-year-olds, were legalized abuse. Medieval and early modern royal marriage treated girls as broodmares to be impregnated the moment their bodies were physically capable, regardless of psychological readiness or medical safety. The cost was astronomical. Think about what they endured. Constant pregnancy and childbirth without anesthesia, antibiotics, or modern obstetrics. Labors lasting days. Infections that meant death. Permanent physical damage including prolapse, fistulas, and chronic pain. Miscarriages and stillbirths. Watching infant after infant die. Bodies aged beyond recognition by age 30. Death in childbirth stalking every pregnancy. They lived when maternal mortality rates reached 25%. When 1 in 4 women died giving birth or shortly after. When infection was a death sentence. When medical treatment often caused more harm than good. Yet they chose or were forced to risk death again and again. Pregnancy after pregnancy. Year after year. Because in their world producing heirs was survival. Today we have epidurals, cesarean sections, blood transfusions, antibiotics, and maternal mortality rates below 0.02% in developed nations. They had prayers, herbs, and midwives with no formal training. What they accomplished, surviving multiple teenage pregnancies, would still be considered medically risky today. In their era, it was nothing short of miraculous. Why should we care about royal women who died centuries ago? Because understanding their stories changes how we see history. Behind every European dynasty, every shifting alliance, every throne secured is a woman who literally sacrificed her body to make it possible. History isn't just kings and battles. It's the girls who produced those kings, often dying in the process. Because while we've made incredible progress, we still live in a world where child marriage exists, where girls are married to older men, where women's reproductive rights remain battlegrounds. In 2024, millions of girls worldwide are still being married before age 18, still being impregnated before their bodies are ready, still risking death in childbirth, because their societies value heirs over their lives. Because beyond crowns and dynasties, these are fundamentally human stories of resilience and survival against impossible odds. They remind us that women have always found ways to create power, even in systems designed to reduce them to vessels. Remember that royal bedchamber we pictured at the beginning, the 15-year-old girl beside the 60-year-old king. Now you understand that moment wasn't just physical exploitation. It was political calculation, strategic endurance, and wielding power in the only way available. Margaret, Isabella, Cecily, Charlotte, Maria Anna, and Leonor weren't just victims. They were warriors who fought with the only weapons their world allowed them. They lived when women's bodies weren't their own, when pregnancy could be a death sentence, when maternal mortality stalked every delivery room, when producing heirs was the only power society would acknowledge. Yet they transformed this brutal expectation into political strategy. They turned biological vulnerability into dynastic foundation. They proved that even in worlds designed to reduce them to incubators, they could still reshape history one dangerous pregnancy at a time. In the end, they showed us that the most powerful weapon in royal politics wasn't the sword or the crown. It was the young womb, strategically deployed by women intelligent and desperate enough to survive impossible odds. They just paid a price no human being should ever have to pay for that power. If this deep dive into history's most exploited royal women moved you, please leave a like and share this video. Comment below which of these women's stories affected you most and why. And subscribe for more untold stories of women who shaped history despite systems designed to destroy them. Thanks for joining me on this journey through time. Until next time, remember, behind every crown is a woman who paid for it with her body.